Okay, good morning and good evening to you guys at the Petroleum Institute. Are there any questions before I begin? Any concerns about your assignment, projects? Okay. Then let's get started. In the last lecture, we looked at some of the papers from the literature that apply all the methods that we have seen in more realistic problems, complicated problems, and we arranged the level of complication progressively. So we looked at the convection in a loop, and I think that's a very nice paper that talks about how to model natural convection in a loop, essentially a one-dimensional problem. And then we looked at the sudden expansion, which is a two-dimensional problem, which gives rise to symmetry breaking spontaneously, and experimentally it has been observed as well. These are all derived from the fluid mechanics, the transport processes. And then we started talking about the flow-past cylinder and half bifurcation, how to implement that particular algorithm to detect a natural phenomena that was first observed experimentally. That is the vortex shedding phenomena for flow past a cylinder, and that is two-dimensional dynamic. If you're looking at half bifurcation, whereas the quanta effect is two-dimensional steady state, and the convection loop is a one-dimensional dynamic problem. So I'm going to look at two more problems today: Taylor-Couette flow and flow in curved duct. These are what are called quasi two-dimensional, almost three-dimensional, somewhere between two and three-dimensional. Some of you have selected problems that might require this knowledge, so I will just briefly talk about how does it differ from a strictly two-dimensional flow. One of the questions I guess I was going to ask you after last lecture is concerning this convection in a loop. If you recall, we approximated the solution in terms of sines and cosines, Fourier series, I said, and we derived an equation for the coefficients of the Fourier series as a function of time. Can you think about why Fourier series and why not some other series as a basis function? Why would Fourier series be a natural fit for the particular problem? It has to do with the geometry of the problem itself. What do you think Fourier series is a good fit for that? Am I making the question clear? What do you know about sines and cosines? If you go around 2 pi, you come back to the same position, right? And that's what happens in that loop. You have a closed loop, so there is a natural periodicity built in there. So if I had taken some other basis functions, a simple basis function which we are going to only talk today is 1 squared x cubed. Okay, that wouldn't have that periodicity built in. So you need to impose that as an external condition, whereas these basis functions that they have chosen are natural for that particular problem. And it is true for any simulation where you have a periodic box as your simulation domain. Fourier series is a good choice. And so those class of methods are called spectral methods, for example. They are very well developed in numerical analysis. So let's get back to this flow past various objects. Okay. So I just wanted to show you some of the results. Again, let me emphasize the difference between 2D and what I call pseudo 2D. This is a strictly 2D problem because there are only two velocity components, u and v, and they are functions of only two spatial positions, x and y. That is a truly two-dimensional problem. So perpendicular to the board, the geometry would simply be extruded and then translated. I guess I don't have the figure. I deleted the figure. Okay, what we had was figures like this. Okay, that's a symmetry, and perpendicular to the board, it's essentially extruded. And you will have flow past this, and once the symmetry breaking occurs, you will have these vortices that are alternately shedded from the top and the bottom. So there is a frequency at which these vortices are shedded. And that is one of the unknowns that we want to predict using this Hopf bifurcation point. And that was the main contribution of this. As I said, even though this was understood very long time ago, it's called one common vortex tree, computation of this precisely was done quite late. And this paper appeared, I think, in the 80s or 90s. 87, right? And the results that they obtained by solving the Navier-Stokes equation, discretizing it using finite element method, and which is, we're going to see the basic ideas behind that. We will not be able to develop a two-dimensional finite element code in this course. A CFD course will actually take you through the process of developing a Navier-Stokes solver, where we look at various discretizations and build all the modules. At the end of it, you have a two-dimensional Navier-Stokes solver as a tool. But we are relying on COMSOL for that purpose. Okay? And this is what we were talking about towards the end of this course. It's important that you understand when you look at an equation that looks pretty complicated with a lot of Greek symbols, but it is essentially the same idea that we talked about in the class, basically imposing the condition that you have a pair of purely imaginary eigenvalues, and that is the point where what you call as a Hopf bifurcation point, and identifying what the various terms are. So Gx is your Jacobian, and psi r and psi I that you see here are the real part and the imaginary part of the eigenvector, and omega is the frequency, the purely imaginary eigenvalue. Okay, that is the frequency of oscillation, and the lambda is your distinguished parameter that you are solving for. At what value of lambda does that occur, that you have a pair of purely imaginary eigenvalues? So they solve this and they give the results in tabular form. So the nice thing about numerical approach is once you have developed the tool, you can study all of these. Experimentally, if you have to do this for every shape and for every angle, for example, this is the angle that they keep changing in the simulation. It's going to be a lot of effort, but once you have the code, you can just let it run and produce the critical points as a function of this tilt angle. Okay? So you can change the ratio of major axis to minor axis. If there is one, you get a cylinder. If it is not one, you get an ellipse. And then by changing the angle of orientation, you can look at what happens to the frequency and what happens to the critical Reynolds number at which the vortex shading begins. Vortex shading occurs on all these geometries. When you have a cross across a cylindrical object, you have this phenomenon. And I think in the transport phenomena course, I actually showed you a picture of cloud formation where this kind of a behavior occurred. Okay? So in the extreme limit, when you take the minor axis going to 0, and then you get a flat plate. Okay, so you have flow past a flat plate that is oriented at a different angle, and then they have flow past a triangle. Of course, they didn't orient this. So from that point on, the main part of this paper is it breaks open that possibility for looking at these complex dynamics and various shapes. And then, of course, there are lots of other papers that would have come and looked at various other shapes, etc. Those are incremental knowledge that we gain from that. But what you get from this analysis is this important table, okay, that tells you the ratio of the major axis to minor axis. When that is 1, you have a cylinder, and this is experimentally validated. Okay. The critical Reynolds number for the onset of this vortex shedding is around 45. And the Struhal number is a dimensionless form of the frequency that you calculate by solving the Hopf bifurcation point location. And Struhal number, in fact, is defined according to this omega that comes from that solution of the Hopf condition and normalized with respect to L over V. L is some characteristic length for the geometry. For a cylinder, it will be just the radius of the cylinder. For other shapes, you can use an equivalent hydraulic diameter if you like. And V is the approach velocity. Okay, so this is how the Struhal number changes over the range of the ellipse dimensions. And as I said, the Struhal frequency also agrees quite well with circular cylinder, for which there is a lot of experimental data. And since then, people have looked at two cylinders in tandem, one behind the other, side by side. The possibilities are endless, but the basic idea remains the same. And this is for an ellipse with a ratio of 2 to 1. Okay, major axis is 1, minor axis is 0.5, and then you change the angle of the orientation of the minor axis with respect to the horizontal, going all the way from 0 to 90 degrees. And that's how the critical Reynolds number. So the critical onset of the Hopf bifurcation changes quite a bit, by a factor of almost 3 or 4, I guess, as you change the orientation for an ellipse. Okay. So this one corresponds to something like this. Okay, that's this one. And 90 degrees would be something like this. Okay, the minor axis to the flow direction. The flow direction is like this. Okay, this one corresponds to this. So you should, when you are bored, you should read some of these papers to understand what the problem is, how they have set it up, and how does it relate to what we have seen in this course, and what are the main results. And that's the same idea, that's the same level of focus I want you to do for your project, except you all implement some of the intermediate steps in COMSOL to get some of the results. Now, this is a very classic, important problem. There are literally thousands of papers on this. And this was a work that actually inspired me in the 90s to get involved in learning about this kind of a nonlinear phenomena in flow problems. What is the problem? It's a Taylor-Couette flow. Okay, so it is a flow between two concentric cylinders. Was studied by G.A. Taylor, one of the famous fluid dynamicists. And he did the hydrodynamic stability to predict the first onset of instability from a one-dimensional flow between these two cylinders. So the inner cylinder is rotating, for example, and it's an infinitely long cylinder. Okay. We have studied this in the transport phenomena course, but for those from Petroleum Institute, I hope you have seen this problem before. If not, that lecture is also on YouTube. You should be able to go and review those. Basically, the flow pattern that you will expect from this one is one where there will be, the coordinate systems are going to be radial, angular, and axial. Okay? So you have R as a coordinate and theta as a coordinate measured along this, and Z as the third coordinate. But in the Z direction, it's infinitely long. So the velocity components that we are going to propose are, so V, the velocity vector, is going to consist of the radial velocity component, which we will say 0 initially, and the angular velocity component V theta, which will be a function of R only, the radius, and the axial Z component, which is. This is the basic one-dimensional flow, which Navier-Stokes equation can be solved analytically. And Taylor looked at that flow and asked the question, as I keep increasing the rotational speed of the inner cylinder, does that flow remain stable for all rotational speed? And what he found experimentally was it was not true. At a certain critical number, critical rotational speed, you will see that there are some cells that are forming here that are nicely periodically placed. So looking back, we look at this problem as one where we are breaking symmetry. What kind of symmetry are we breaking? The translational invariance, which meant this velocity profile is the same whether you take a Z plane at the bottom or an Z plane at the top. It is invariant with respect to Z translation. That is broken when the transition from this to a flow where the velocity field now consists of VR as a function of R and Z, and V theta as a function of R and Z, and Vz as a function of R and Z. So there are three velocity components, and all of them are dependent on two spatial positions. This is why we call it quasi 2D. It's not quite 3D, it's not quite 2D. because you do have all three velocity components. Okay? So if you have a cell like this, that means the flow is going out and then coming back. So that gives you a radial component as well as an axial component as it comes down and goes up. So VR and VZ are introduced by that cell structure. And of course, because of the rotation, V theta is always there. But V theta depends also on Z. So we are breaking the continuous translational symmetry into a discrete one. Okay? It's not completely broken, but if you translate it by the period of these cells, you'll get exactly the same solution. Okay? And Taylor was able to, and it could be done only numerically. You can do the hydrodynamic stability analysis, but ultimately you will get into an eigenvalue problem in any stability problem, right? So he had to solve that eigenvalue problem by hand in 1920s. That paper was published in 1927. And he printed exactly what rotational speed this will occur and verified it in an experiment. Now, there is a catch. How did he validate it in an experiment? Because you cannot do an experiment with infinitely long cylinder, right? The theory was developed for an infinitely long cylinder. Okay? So what he did was used a very large aspect ratio, 50 to 1. Okay? That is the gap between these two. If this is 1, it's not writing here. If the gap between, I guess I need to find a way because the guys Petroleum Institute cannot see that. I think the calibration has gone out on the screen, so let me write on this one. Okay, so this is the key geometry. What is the gap between these two cylinders as opposed to the length of the cylinder? Okay, so he used L over D to be much, much larger than 150 or so to experimentally approach the limit of an infinitely long cylinder. And so he was able to obtain very good agreement between what he predicted and what actually he observed. But this paper, almost 90 years after, 80 years after, yes, this appeared in 2002, I guess. Yeah, 80 years. Looks at the problem of the same problem, erase this, but flow between two concentric cylinders with very short aspect ratio. Instead of infinitely long, as I said, the parameter space is vast in these problems. So think of the geometry as just this. Okay. And the inner cylinder is being rotated. And there is a symmetry. This is a wall. That is a wall. And that is, I mean, all are walls, but this wall is moving. The inner wall is rotating at a certain angular velocity, omega, and the rest of the walls are stationary. So in that situation, you can always identify a plane of symmetry. Okay? And if you reflect the top to the bottom, you'll get exactly the same solution. So there is a symmetry in the problem. Bifurcation problems are always about this. There is a symmetry in the problem and the symmetry is broken. This is why when I was doing this kind of work in the middle 90s, my colleagues would come and always ask, why are you working on this problem? What is the practical application for this? I would always get away by saying, well, they are very challenging problems. I like them. It's interesting. But there is a point in that. And the point is, if you go to a chemical equipment, there are no nice symmetries like this. All the symmetries are broken, right? So you don't have this problem of selecting multiple solutions, etc. in flow problems, because there is no symmetry and you probably get only one solution for that particular geometry. The same thing would happen if I break the symmetry forcefully by simply looking at the geometry that is not a rectangle, but maybe something like this. Okay, so if I take something like this, a random shape, there is no symmetry. Then I will get only one solution to the Navier-Stokes equation. The fact that these problems have a lot of symmetries and nature wants to break those symmetries as you excite them. Why does that happen? I don't know. I've read a popular article in Science, I think, some time back. Physicists, for example, have this matter and antimatter concept, and apparently the origin of this universe is possible only because symmetry was broken at the very beginning. Again, according to those equations, right? If there was exactly the same number of matter and antimatter, and they annihilate each other, there's nothing left. So that this symmetry was broken there, and there was something left, and that's what we are looking at apparently. I'm not a physicist, but when I read that and I was doing work on these, it looked fascinating that these things occur in nature, not only in fluid mechanics, which is my area, but in other areas as well. But there are problems where multiplicity really occurs in chemical reactors. That's an important physically realizable situation. Okay? But coming back to this problem, so there is a symmetry, and so when you start rotating it slowly, you will not get the one-dimensional flow that we talked about, because that's for an idealization, infinitely long cylinder. Because of the end walls, you will always get two cells, even though you have very low rotational speed. Why does that occur? Can you understand it from a physics point of view, from a fluid mechanical point of view? Okay, why do we have a one-dimensional flow as the solution when I have an infinitely long cylinder, when the inner cylinder is rotating at an angular velocity? The velocity profile is going to be looking like this. Okay, the inner cylinder has a higher velocity, and then the velocity just keeps increasing. This is the v theta component against r. But in a finite geometry, that will not be possible. That will not be possible to have one-dimensional solution, because that one-dimensional solution will not satisfy the boundary condition at the ends. Okay. So what happens near the boundary when you have a fluid like this? If you're starting this setup, as the inner wall rotates, it's going to transfer the momentum internally. So it wants to get the whole fluid moving. Okay. But if it can get the whole fluid moving uniformly in this direction, you will get a one-dimensional propagation of flux. But because the wall wants to keep it stagnant, that means the fluid has to be having a gradient in that direction. And that gradient is not going to be zero in the name of approximation. That generates as a source for the secondary flow. So this is what we will call as the secondary flow. In a plane, in a RZ plane, there is flow that is going radially out in the center and then returns like this. Okay, and then there is a flow perpendicular to this. Okay, because remember, perpendicular to this, it's not a translation, it's a rotation, because it's a cylinder, right? So there would be a velocity component in that direction. That's what makes it a truly three-dimensional velocity field. The velocity depends on all three velocity components are non-zero, but they depend only on R and Z, two spatial positions. In COMSOL, you have, so remember, in COMSOL you're selecting 1D or 2D or 3D. This is neither 2D nor 3D, right? But it is 2D, comes under 2D, but there is a flag, it's called swirl flow. So you have to check the swirl flow equation. Then it automatically pulls all those additional equations. What are those additional equations that we are talking about? Remember, what COMSOL is a general Navier-Stokes solver, and by simply identifying it as 1D, 2D, or 3D, you are canceling the terms that are zero and solving the remaining reduced set of equations. So in this particular case, we will have R momentum equation, theta momentum equation, and Z momentum equation, plus continuity equation. We're solving 4 equations, but they're all dependent on only 2 spatial dimensions. Okay? So when you're drawing the geometry, you just need to draw this rectangle and identify this as an axisymmetric model with swirl flow. Then it will pull all those 4 equations. If you identify it as just 2D without axisymmetric or without swirl flow, you will just pull down those 2 momentum equations in the R and the Z direction, because we'll assume that there is no swirl flow perpendicular to this body. Am I making sense or not? Yeah.
What does the swirl flow add to the model that just a 2D axisymmetric?
Okay.
Simulate.
It's very, very important to understand that. Let me see whether I can open up the paper and show you. Okay, can you guys see this paper? Everybody? I hope all the So I'm going to talk about this problem also later on, but let me try to use this to illustrate the difference between swirl flow axisymmetric and non-swirling axisymmetric. Okay, so this is also a problem like this, where you have not a closed system. Taylor-Couette flow, just like in the loop problem, there is a 2-pi symmetric closed one. So axisymmetric means you take a cut any angle, you'll get the same flow. There's no theta dependence. Okay? In this particular problem, there is a theta dependence also because it's what is called an open channel flow. It's again a problem that was studied in 1927 by Dean. So it's called the Dean problem. These vortices are called Dean vortices. The only difference, I mean, there are two differences between Taylor-Couette flow and the Dean flow. Okay? The Taylor-Couette flow is a closed system. You drive the flow by a moving boundary. In the Dean problem, you have an applied pressure gradient that drives the flow. It's a curved channel. It's a curved coiled tube, helical coils, right? So you have a pump and you're pumping the fluid, and it forms the same secondary flows in this as well as in the Taylor-Couette flow. But there are important differences in the dynamics. But let's just understand and answer Tom's question of what are the differences in equations. We'll live with that. So these are the three momentum equations. Okay. If I say axisymmetric, two-dimensional, then I will not have a flow in the angular direction. Okay. So I will drop off all the terms that depend on W. Okay. Suppose U and V are the two velocity coordinates in the R and the Z direction. Okay. So I'll have the first two momentum equation, but the third momentum equation will not be there. But if there is a swirl flow, then there is flow perpendicular to that plane that I showed you. So this momentum equation must be included. And COMSOL does that automatically for you if you pick the swirl flow option in addition to axisymmetric. But if you just say axisymmetric two-dimensional, then it will drop this equation. So it will solve for only two velocity components that are in the domain itself. Okay. Let me ask you, just to make sure that the idea is clear, ask the question yourself, can you think of a scenario where you have two-dimensional axisymmetric flow? When you have a cylinder that is rotating, it's not possible to have a two-dimensional axisymmetric flow. It's a problem that we've seen in transport phenomena course. You still remember it from there. Think of a situation where you will have an axisymmetric, but two-dimensional. Suppose I give you so I have an inner cylinder and then an outer cylinder. The inner cylinder is being pulled with a certain velocity. Okay. So what would the flow profile look like? It's a closed outer channel. I think it was in fact in one of the PhD qualifications one of the years too. Right? So how would the flow profile look like? It will move along this, and it has to turn around. Right? So it is going to depend on both R and Z. Okay. But if you take this plane, cut at any angle, it's going to be the same. So there are only two velocity components, and they depend only on the two spatial variables. So you don't need the third momentum equation. But the moment I start putting some twist on this rotation on the inner cylinder, then you will get the third velocity component automatically.
Still solving it in 2D plane.
Still solving it in 2D. That is the situation when you need the 2D axisymmetric swirl flow option in the COMSOL. Okay, is that clear? The difference between 2D axisymmetric and 2D axisymmetric swirl flow. But what happens, getting back to this problem, is as you keep increasing the rotational speed of the inner cylinder, you find a situation like this. Remember, I don't know why they didn't put the boundary around it. It's the same geometry. Okay? But what do you see in the cells? There's only one dominant cell, and there is a small secondary cell. And it broke the symmetry about the center axis. This occurs only at a higher critical rotational speed. Then the immediate question is, because the equations have symmetry in here, the mirror image of this should also be a solution to Navier-Stokes, and that is symmetry breaking. Okay? So this will continue to be a solution beyond the critical rotational speed, but an unstable solution, whereas these are stable, experimentally realizable solutions. So people are still finding new things about the Taylor-Couette problem 80, 90 years after the original work. And this work used all the tools that we have talked about and more to map out how the bifurcation structure looks like when this transition occurs from a 2-cell to a 1-cell. Okay. For small aspect ratios. So he defines gamma as an aspect ratio, which is the ratio of this length to this diameter. Okay. And then you have a Reynolds number as the second parameter. That is determined by the rotational speed. So he maps in this 2-dimensional parameter space of Reynolds number and aspect ratio what happens to these critical points. And he used the continuation method, and I'll just show you some of the results. Okay. These are used using the continuation, outline continuation method. Okay. So here you have a stable solution, a pitchfork bifurcation point, a symmetry breaking one, that somehow comes back to the close here. Okay. And this is at a certain value of gamma, the aspect ratio. If you change the aspect ratio, the behavior changes completely. Caption, I guess it's too small for you to see, but this is gamma of 0.50 to gamma of 0.6, 0.73, 0.707. But some of these critical values, the behavior changes completely over a very short value, 0.78 to 0.707. And the connectivity of these solutions changes quite a lot. And the power of these methods allow us to track how the dynamical behavior changes. So Reynolds number is one of the parameters, and each figure is for different values of gamma. And what they did then is looked at these critical points, calculated the limit points, or the symmetry breaking bifurcation point. Symmetry breaking bifurcation point is like a limit point, right? If you take this curve alone, it looks like a limit point on that curve. Right? So the algorithm is very similar. There are some additional restrictions we need to place, and I'll talk about it in the next paper. So they took all these critical points and plotted how does that critical point change as you change gamma from one value to another value. That is from this figure to the next figure to the next figure. And they constructed a figure which is the highlight of that particular work. It's this figure. So we are plotting Reynolds number against the second parameter gamma and plotting the boundaries of these critical points. How do these critical points change? How would you determine that? You know how to write the extended system, right? So you solve the extended system to find a critical value for Reynolds number and keep changing the second parameter gamma. You're basically solving only for critical points, okay? And that allows you to calculate the locus of all the critical points on the problem. And the data points are from experiments. Okay? That's the beauty of this paper, is that they have good agreement of a very complex dynamical behavior that theory predicts from Navier-Stokes, and then experiments agree with that. There are lots of papers like this on the Taylor-Couette book. And of course, that's the question that would come to mind is, does this problem have a Hopf bifurcation point? These are all from one steady state to another steady state, from 2-cell to 1-cell, then to 3 cells, etc. Right? What would the Hopf bifurcation point look like? As a graduate student, that's a kind of asking good questions is half the job done. Okay, the remaining other half is finding answers to it. But you should start thinking about it and ask what kind of questions are interesting for research point of view. And the answer turns out to be yes. There are, obviously, when you keep increasing the rotational speed to higher and higher, the flow becomes double, right? And these studies are aimed at trying to understand the transition from laminar flow to the turbulent flow. And a Hopf bifurcation point is one where two-dimensional axisymmetric nature will give way to a fully three-dimensional time-dependent flow. So we need to consider all of the Navier-Stokes equations in three dimensions and in time, and look at the critical Taylor number or Reynolds number, where the first onset of half bifurcation gives rise to sustained oscillations in your solution. And it turns out that in the Taylor-Couette flow, there are actually beautiful experiments that you will be able to see online. There are lots of videos and stuff. So when you have axis symmetry, if I take a cut here or a cut here, I should get the same profile. That's what axis symmetry means. When the axis symmetry is broken, you get profiles like this. There are still cells, but the cells have a dependence on the angle, a periodic dependence on the angle. It's not 2 pi period, but it's a subset. So again, a continuous symmetry in the angular direction is broken into a discrete symmetry. Okay? But these are not stationary waves. These are waves that will be moving fast. So if you see it at one instant of time, it will be like this. The next instant of time, they will move. So if you do the experiment, it's very nice to see those experiments. You will see these waves just going round and round at a different speed from the rotational speed, of course, determined by the nonlinear dynamics of the response of the system itself. Okay. So it's a really fascinating area in terms of phenomena that it can exhibit. And as I said, 2 or 3 manuscripts and monographs have come on the Taylor-Couette flow problem alone. Just like in Lorentz problem, there is a manuscript devoted entirely to study the Lorentz equation. So the last example I want to look at is this flow, the Dean problem. Okay, the Taylor problem is the one where you have a closed 2 pi symmetry, and the Dean problem is one where you have a pump that is pumping a fluid through a curved channel. And this was a problem that we used to learn a lot of these techniques. And this paper was kind of inspiration to me at the time, 1987. So the geometry is a coiled tube, but in this case it's a duct. And so you have a reflective symmetry about this axis, so you'll have 2 cells. And for the circular pipe, it was solved by Dean. That's why it's called the Dean problem in 1957, using asymptotic methods, the perturbation methods that we talked about in transport phenomena, of course. But here are the equations, the Navier-Stokes equations. And you'll see this is there are 3 coordinates. The 3 coordinates are the local coordinate. Here he calls it x and y. And then this is the angular direction. Okay, so he sets up. This is why coordinate transformation, but again we talked about curvilinear coordinates, and the transport phenomena course becomes important because you expand the Navier-Stokes equation in this particular coordinate, x, y, and phi. It's essentially like cylindrical coordinates. Okay? But we are assuming to be, again, fully developed. Here, axis symmetry doesn't make sense because you have flow coming in and going out. So you assume fully developed state, and that means it doesn't change in the phi direction. Okay? And under those conditions, the Navier-Stokes equation would reduce to the specific form that we have here. Okay, so this is the x component momentum equation, y component momentum equation, and phi component momentum equation. So it is again a swirl flow. 2-dimensional swirl flow. And you have, of course, the continuity equation. They were all from the same school, C.P. Jackson that I showed you earlier, and Winters. And so you'll see the same structure of the paper. The problem is different. They're profoundly different. Taylor-Couette flow is profoundly different from the Dean flow. But you take those equations, they use the same code, finite element code, and discretize it, you get an algebraic equation format. And you use the same tool. The reason I put this paper is because he has the best summary of all the extended systems. So these are all the types of bifurcation points that we can look at. So here you have, for example, a pitch chord, a limit point, and this is called a double limit point. So what happens is you have an S-shaped curve, which you already solved in one of your problems. As you change the second parameter, these 2 limit points come close together and then disappear. Okay? And that would be called a double limit point. So what are the extended systems under each one of these conditions? So That's a good paper to read, and this is called a transcritical bifurcation point, where you have two paths that are kind of disconnected. But as you change the second parameter, they come together like this, and then split off in a different way. So this is called a transcritical bifurcation point. So the stability changes according to this. The solution that remains stable here becomes unstable. And this that was unstable there becomes stable at this point. So again, the stability change occurs in all of these situations. And here is an extended system. Now let's spend some time on this, trying to understand what is this extended system for. Yes? The first set of equations is the normal nonlinear algebraic equations. Lambda is the distinguished parameter, x is the state vector. In our case, it will contain all the velocity components at every grid point. The second one is the Jacobian multiplied by the eigenvector. And we are saying that it is equal to 0. The third one is the normalizing condition. Okay. And it looks like, as I said, it is what we saw for a limit point. Okay. But he gives it as an extended system for symmetry breaking method. He also has another one for limit point, which will be exactly the same set of equations. There is only one catch. There is one difference. Okay. For the limit point, this phi can be, it has to be the null vector, but you don't put any restrictions on that. For symmetry breaking bifurcation point, you put the condition that this phi must belong to what you call the anti-symmetric space. Okay. So if the solutions are symmetric, the eigenvector must be anti-symmetric. Okay. And we know what the symmetry conditions are. Okay. What are the symmetry conditions we saw? For the Coanda problem, for example, when you put xy as equal to x minus y, a reflection, then u remains the same. U at xy is equal to u at x minus y, but v at xy is equal to v minus v at x minus y. Okay, this is what symmetry implies. Okay, so the solutions that you have for u and v must satisfy this, but the solutions that you get for phi must satisfy the anti-symmetry condition. That means you just flip the signs on all these. Phi must satisfy those conditions. Okay. And then you get the location of the symmetry. But to implement that is going to be a lot of work. So I'm just exposing you to the basic concepts here. And if you ever get into studying this in great detail, then you need to really figure out how to implement. So for implementation, I've just given you some very simple ideas of how to get started. So this is the limit point. So it's the same extended system, but without that restriction. Okay. And there are a lot of other extended system equations. Non-degenerate hysteresis point. What does he mean by that? Two double limit points coming together. So you need to take actually the second derivative of the Jacobian. Okay. And there are two vectors, and there is a left eigenvector and the right eigenvector. Something that we talked about at the very beginning of this course. So they all come in handy, the concept, when we implement potential systems. I have never implemented this myself. I have implemented the symmetry breaking, the limit point, etc. in some of our work. So taking a second derivative is going to be a lot more work from the Jacobian, because you're taking the derivative of the Jacobian. Transcritical bifurcation point. And then he also has a summary continuation like this. So again, it's a good paper to see how all these things are brought to bear in studying a particular fluid mechanics problem. And this is the main result from this paper. So here you're plotting some state function, velocity at the center, for example, of the tap, against Q. Q is the flow rate that you're pumping through that channel. And you will find that there is a two-cell pattern, and it becomes unstable, and there is a four-cell pattern. So how does it look? So the two-cell pattern will look like this. There is a four-cell pattern. It will look like this. Okay. Why does this occur? Can we understand it from a physical point of view? If I have a channel like this, and I have a pressure-driven flow, what would the velocity profile look like if I plot the velocity profile along this line? The velocity profile is going to maybe look like this. It shoots to the outside. So the velocity in the inner part is 0, no slip. Outer part is 0, no slip. This is the axial velocity in the channel. So if you take a fluid element at this point where it is maximum and a fluid element here, what do we have in terms of the centrifugal force? What causes these secondary cells to emerge? That's a good question to ask before we answer this one. Even in the Taylor-Couette flow, infinitely long cylinder, the inner one is rotating, the outer one is stationary, and oops. Did I lose the screen? Sorry guys. Yeah, my screen is very touch sensitive. Okay, so if I take the velocity profile like this, if I take a fluid element here and a fluid element there, the fluid element near the inner one is moving at a higher velocity, so it is facing a higher centrifugal force, right? The one at the outer edge is lower velocity. So the centrifugal force will tend to throw the fluid radially outwards, right? But what is stopping the fluid element being thrown out? It has to overcome the viscosity, right? So these are the two competing forces. The inertial force the centrifugal force trying to push the fluid out, and the viscous forces trying to retain it. So it's a competition between these. When the centrifugal force becomes dominant enough compared to the viscous force, it will be thrown out. And that's when we will see these cells develop. Okay, then continuity will make sure that they come back in to some way. Okay, that's what breaks the cellular formation. If you understand this, the same thing happens here. Why does these additional two cells form at a high enough flow rate? The centrifugal force must overcome the viscous forces. And the only place where it can happen is here, because we have a faster moving fluid compared to the slower moving fluid as you go radially out. That's a centrifugally unstable region. This region or this region is centrifugally unstable region. So once you exceed a critical value, additional cells can form there. These cells are very good for mixing. So in microchannels, for example, one of the ways to enhance mixing, because mixing in microchannels is a challenging problem. Only diffusion has to work because there's no turbulence. So if you can create these convection currents, then you can mix them much better. So people have looked at, I think that's Tom's work on spiral. Right? You create secondary forces there, secondary cells promote mixing. So I think that's the end of pie in the sky kind of paper discussion. With 5 papers I have given you, they're all excellent papers. I think you should take a look at them, but follow the thought process that I've kind of followed in this class. So reading your own 10 papers in your own project area and try to synthesize and put ideas together in your literature review. Incorporating what we have learned from we are now going to ground level again, start from 0. So at this point, you need to be able to understand the implementation issues, okay, which we saw earlier. How do we implement everything? We see from the simplest problems. And of course, the more glorified problem of partial differential equations, it's an enormously time-consuming task. But if you understand the concept, then you understand COMSOL at a different level. You can use it in a much more intelligent and wise fashion, not just as a black box. So I'm going to try to bridge that gap of how do we do spatial discretization. So we have seen linear, nonlinear algebraic equations, dynamical equations to some extent. So the next chapter, again, whole course can be given on this, called functional approximation, next idea. How do we approximate functions? Why do we approximate functions? And how do we take these ideas in solving differential equations, whether it is ordinary or partial functions. So what is a functional approximation problem? The problem, there are a number of applications for it, but you can be stated like this. If you give me a function f of x, but it's a very complicated function. Okay? It can be a Bessel function, it can be an error function. I know what it is. It's an infinite series expansion, for example. Okay? And I want to construct an approximation to it. Okay? That is a functional approximation problem. Given a complicated function, I want to construct an approximate representation of that so that I can use it for simple calculations. I don't need to go and evaluate this complex expression, which is a kind of an irrelevant argument nowadays because all these complex functions are already programmed into calculators. The power of the computers is so high. Bessel function, error function. At one time, we used to have tables. Still, there are mathematical handbooks of tables that will have tables of error functions for various values, Bessel functions for various values, etc. But nowadays, you don't need that because they are all programmed. But still, it is one of the motivating factors for looking at what the problem is and trying to understand it. More relevant example would be, instead of fitting approximation for a given function, fitting an approximation for given data. Okay? Because we all collect data from experiments, okay, where we have a control variable and observer, and we wanted to get a mathematical representation of it. A good example would be you are doing a reaction problems. A reaction problem. My screen is touch sensitive. Both of them are, so I should not touch it. So you are plotting, for example, C versus time in a CSTR. Okay. Maybe let's take a batch reaction. So what is happening is you are putting some chemicals into the reactor, mixing it, taking samples of concentration at various times, and plotting concentration versus time. It may be like this if it is a reactant, or it may be like this if it is a product that you are modifying. Okay? And the question is, can I develop an expression for the rate of reaction? Professor Dooley's class, you have seen this a lot in that course. And given a set of data, how do I construct a rate model for that? Okay? So of course you need to go into understanding the electrochemistry, the mechanisms of reaction, etc. to come up with a model. That model for the rate of reaction can be pretty complicated, okay, not linear. But you have only the data, so you need to find the parameters in that model by fitting that functional approximation you have to the data to get the best parameter values. That problem can also be posed in the same framework that we are talking about here. Okay. So these are the two reasons, preliminary reasons for us for looking at the functional approximation problem. And then we will see how we can use that for solving differential equations in an approximate way using the same ideas. So if you're given me a function f of x and I approximate it by a polynomial of certain degree n, okay, and I'm going to represent that as a linear combination of a set of n functions, and I call these as the basis functions. What is a basis function? It's a set of linearly independent functions that I can use to construct any other function that I want. Okay? So one example of a basis function would be 1x, x squared, x cubed, etc. We use that and take a finite number of terms from that basis, and we get a polynomial representation. Okay. Another set of bases that we saw is sine n by x, for example, or cos n by x. Okay. So what does this allow you to do? In any of these bases will allow you to basically do the following from a pictorial or a graphical point of view. If I have a function f of x that looks complicated like this, what I want to do is I want to see whether I can represent that function by combining all these functions with appropriate weights. Okay. So if I take, for example, this basis set, the first function I'm going to say is this. It's a constant, 1. Right? So I could put an a with that to scale it up and down. So I can say, so this complicated function has an average value of that, so my approximation is the average value of that. Okay? I'm taking only one term from that series there. The next best thing I can do is, no, it's not a constant, but it is linear. Okay? So I can write a plus bx. And so I will put a straight line through that, and that straight line may be like this. So if there is a slight slope to that data, I can say, okay, instead of being constant, it is a straight line that is running through that. If I see that there is a curvature to the data, I can say, okay, I can take the next set in that. I can put a parabola through that. Okay. So the idea of approximating a given function by taking progressively higher terms in the series to achieve closer and closer to the actual function. But what we need to recognize is that there is an error between actual function, which is given by this curve. This is the actual function. and its approximation, which I have represented by the polynomial. Okay? And they are not going to be exactly the same. And I'm going to call that difference as the error. And that error depends on the coefficients that I have introduced. So I can tune these coefficients in such a way I minimize the error. That's the basic idea of curve. This is a glorified way of presenting what Excel and MATLAB, Polytech, they do. But once you understand this idea, we can then say, I'm going to take the same idea, except I'm going to take this basis function, this approximation, and plug it into a differential equation. Okay? And the differential equation now is not going to be, all these basis functions are not solutions of the differential equation. That is, when I take the derivative and plug it in, it's not going to be 0. If it is 0, I found out that solution. Right? So there is going to be an error. And that is the same error. So this is what I would call the residual. The residual in this case is obtained by taking the difference between the function and its approximation, or the data and its approximation. But in the case of differential equation, it is simply the functional representations plugged into the differential equation that will not be equal to 0. I'll just call that as a residual. So the whole class of method of weighted residuals is based on this idea. You take a basis function, you construct a representation of a solution, plug it into the differential equation, have some parameters A in there, that will give you the residual, and you try to get the residual to be as close to 0 as possible using a variety of means. Okay, so the method of weighted residuals, collocation method, they are all based on this idea that we're trying to find an approximate solution to the differential equation. Okay? Any questions on that? These are very elementary ideas, but important ideas for us to build on the whole class of approximation methods. So this is actually a material that I'm also in this course I'm teaching at the undergraduate level. So some of these notes are actually taken from there. So it must be pretty easy for you guys. Okay. So I'm taking as an example the basis function I just talked about. P of xi is xi to the power I minus 1, I equals 1, 2, 3. So that is the basis set that I just wrote down. 1 and x squared, etc. Okay. But I take n number of terms. So when you take n number of terms, I get that n minus 1 degree polynomial. It will be a polynomial expression with ai's being the unknowns. Okay. And the specific example that I'm considering is the error function. Do you all know what an error function is? Okay. We saw that again in transport course. It occurs as a solution to a partial differential equation, the diffusion equation, for example. And the error function looks like this. It has nothing to do with errors. It's not named error function. And the independent variable is x. And the independent variable is, let's call this as f. The error function has something like this. And if you want the definition of the error function, it is something like e to the power minus psi squared d psi. And there is a normalizing factor here. Pi or something like this. It's essentially integral of e to the power minus psi squared. You cannot integrate that. There's no analytical integration. You can integrate it term by term. It's being an approximation for e to the power something and get an expression. So it is tabulated. These values are tabulated. And when you plot it, the curve looks like that. MATLAB has a function called E or F. You can use it to actually plot that. So I'm going to take, and this goes from 0 to infinity. Okay, this error function is going all the way to infinity. But around 5 or so, this value approaches 1 asymptotically. So beyond x equal to 5, for practical purposes, the error function is equal to 1. So I've taken data points on the error function between the interval of 0.1 to 0.5. I've taken 4 data points, 0.1, 0.2, 0.35, 0.5. Okay. And I'm taking n equal to 4. There are 4 terms. So my basis set is 1x, x squared, x cubed. So my polynomial then is of 3rd degree because I have only 4 data points. Okay? So a1 plus a2x plus a3x squared plus a4x cubed. My job is to find the best value of the coefficients a1, a2, a3, a4 such that this polynomial representation is a good approximation to the error function. Okay? Do you understand the problem that you're trying to do? It's a very simple curve fitting exercise. Okay? So how do we do that? we pick, this is the idea of collocation. Okay, so we have an error term. The error is not going to be 0 between this polynomial representation and the actual error function that we have here. Okay, so I'm going to make the error equal to 0 exactly at 4 locations. Why 4 locations? Because that's what I've chosen. I've chosen the basis function to be containing 4 different functions, so I have 4 degrees of freedom. I can make the error go to 0 at most at 4 points. Okay? So I'm calculating those 4 points according to the equation that I have given. So this is the essential idea of collocation methods. I'm just posing it in that form. I can just present it as curve fitting exercise. Here I give you 4 points, go and find the 4 coefficients. We'll be able to do that. But it's the same idea that we're going to use when we have differential equations. At certain points, we will make the residual equal to 0 of the differential equation. Then we get the collocation method from the differential equation. Then you can ask the question, is there a better way to select these collocation points? And if you select them as roots of certain orthogonal polynomials, then the error term goes down significantly. Those are called orthogonal collocation. And why? We will see that hopefully when you look at quadratures on those quadratures. Okay. So right now the task at hand is to select these collocation points, and they are selected between the interval a to b in equal intervals. If I have n equal to 4, I want to select 4 data points in that interval. Okay. So, and I want to evaluate that polynomial exactly at those locations. These are the collocation locations. Xk are calculated from this formula that you see here. Okay, and that's very straightforward calculation. In this particular case, I have a as equal to 0.1 and b as equal to 0.5. Okay, so once you know a and b, you plug in here and you select what n is. N is 4, so you can calculate what these points are. Xk is going to be 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Maybe I made a mistake the number of times I picked. I need to have, the error is going to be equally spaced. Okay, it is 0.1 and then maybe 0.233, 0.366. You need to find what that, how many intervals you need to divide that into if you have to have 4 data points in total. So let me just make sure that I sketch this. So this is 0.1, this is 0.5, and I need 2 other points in between, okay, because I need a total of 2 points. Okay? So I can count, and this formula will calculate those locations for you automatically. Okay? And at those points, I am asking the residual to be 0, not at any other point. Okay? So at those points, I want the error between the predicted value from the polynomial and the actual error function value to be equal to 0. So now I have 4 conditions. Are you following all these symbolic equations? So this is where the polynomial is ai x to the power I minus 1. I going from 1 to 3, 4, so that you get the third degree polynomial. And these are the actual function values that are given to you. Okay, either from the data experiments, it's a simply curve fitting problem, or by evaluating this. So now I have 4 equations and 4 unknowns. The 4 unknowns are the coefficients. Okay, these are the collocation points xk, k equal to 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I know these as numbers. I know these as numbers. This is the only unknown. And you can write that as a system of linear equations. So it's a linear curve. As I said very early in the course, everything in numerical analysis is linear algebra. Any problem that we solve, we ultimately convert it into solving a system of linear equations. We saw with Newton method, all the extended system, they're all ending up having to solve an LU decomposition, Gaussian elimination, or the iterative methods like the conjugate linear method. Essentially, you have a linear system that you need to solve where A are the unknowns. And this table just gives you the actual implementation of the numbers. So maybe I'll ask you to go through it by yourself. This is meant for undergraduate courses where I actually plug in the numbers. They have to see what the 4 equations look like. But when you do the curve fitting exercise, the blue line is the actual error function. going from 0 to 3 in this case. You can see that it almost approaches 1. But the curve fitted one is the green line, using the data point that I used in this range. Okay? And you find that it's really a poor representation outside of the range. So in curve fitting, you have to be extremely careful in over what range you fit. So there are then global methods that are methods that the basis function spans the entire space, or local methods which are splines and finite number methods, okay, where the basis function has a local sum. In each element you will have a basis function, and you break it up so that you can use still a lower degree polynomial but get the solutions that are accurate in each region. Okay? So that's one of the differences between global and local methods. Whether the basis function that you use spans the, even though we've used the data only here, we're saying that the function itself is kind of used for any value of x. It's just that it gets to be a very poor representation outside of that. Okay. The other way to improve the accuracy would be take your data points and from the experiment and spread them over the entire range over which you want to fit. You can hopefully get a better approximation. And then increase the degree of the polynomial, you can get better approximation. Okay, but if you have a low degree of polynomial, the errors are going to be high. Or if you use the data over a local support, then also extrapolation is a dangerous thing. That's the basic concept. So these are the actual assembly of the matrix and the coefficient values. In MATLAB, there's a very simple function called polyfit, which does that for you automatically. The process of assembling the matrix, getting the coefficients, and getting the results. So it's a polynomial fit. So the basis functions that are used in polyfit is essentially a polynomial basis function, x, x squared, x cubed, etc. And it will give you these coefficients as an answer. If you pass it to the data set that you want to fit, the degree of the polynomial. Least squares method. What is the basic idea behind least squares method? The collocation method that we saw earlier enforces the error to be 0 at selected points. Okay? There are wise ways of distributing those points, but we saw basically uniform distribution of the points. Okay? Later on, we will see a better distribution of points. Least squares method says, I don't want the error to be exactly equal to 0 at any given fixed point, but I want the average error between the predicted and the observed to be as small as possible. Okay? So you're essentially defining the error still the same way, difference between the predicted value and the actual data point that is given on the function, and then you are defining an objective function here. That objective function is the sum of the square errors. So you take the error at every data point that you have, square it, and sum it up, and divide it by the number of data points, just to make sure that you have a normalized value for the objective function. That objective function depends on the coefficients in the polynomial, or any coefficients in the basis expansion that you have. Okay? And it is our job to find the best value of those coefficients such that this is minimized. Okay? So as opposed to collocation, where we make the error to be equal to 0 at fixed points, we are saying minimize the total error. So it need not pass through the points that we are given. Okay? And the mathematics of it then works out like this. So take the definition of the error, plug it in here, okay, and then take its derivative with respect to each one of the variables in the unknown set, the coefficient, a1, a2, all the way to an. So you will get n equations from that condition. So here you have a scalar equation as a definition of the objective function. But the gradient of the scalar function is equal to 0. That's what we are saying. So that is a vector, okay? Because j depends on a vector function, a. Okay? So when you take the gradient of that, you will get n equations, and so you can clearly see that you had a square, so it's 2 times that error multiplied by, remember you're taking the derivative with respect to a, so when you take the derivative with respect to a, this will remain as a constant. Okay, so you will get that. And then you need to collect and reassemble the matrix. Once again, we are reducing it to a matrix problem. Okay, and these are the unknown vectors, but now the matrix is well formed. This is one of the nice things about least squares method. The previous method, if you go and look at this, you have 1x, x squared, x cubed, x to the power 4. We're taking powers of numbers, right? So if x is less than 1, it's going to keep killing that term. If it is greater than 1, it's going to just multiplying that term. So you get very poor scaling of the matrix in this particular case. Okay? So you'll find numbers that are extremely small compared to 1. Okay? But if you had x larger than 1, then you'll have numbers that will be much larger than 1. So that results in a poorly scaled matrix, which is difficult to invert numerically. But least squares method gives rise to a matrix like this. What is the beauty of this matrix? Right? So whatever you find here is the same as the one that you have here. So it's a nicely balanced symmetric matrix, which is easier to solve. And polyfit does that automatically also. Okay? Polyfit is such a general tool for polynomial curve fitting. If you have 10 data points and you say, give me a third degree polynomial, it will automatically do the least squares fit. But if you have 3 data points and you say, give me a quadratic, it will give you the normal one. Because through 3 data points, you can only fit a quadratic. But if you have 4 data points and you say, give me a cubic, it will be a normal curve fit. But if you say 4 data points, give me a linear one, it will be a least squares automatically. With just comparing the number of data points you had, the degree of the polynomial that you're asking, it determines whether it should do the least squares or the normal one. And there is, in fact, a tool recently, I think, the recent versions of MATLAB called CF2, curve fitting tool. It's a fantastic tool because you don't need to write any program. It's a graphical user interface, and it can take any complicated expression, functions that you want to fit on linear as well. But the ideas are the same. So the basic thing that you need to know is there are 2 types of ideas. One is the collocation point, passing through fixed points. Other one is least square minimization. And method of weighted residuals are all based on that. Okay, so we need to talk about Newton polynomials. These are very elegant polynomials for equally spaced data, and this would form the basis for one of the important methods that we're going to talk about, which is the finite difference method. It's fairly easy to understand, and it gives us derivative approximations for functions, and that allows us to convert differential equations into algebraic equations. So maybe at this point I will stop because I don't want to introduce a new topic, and I got myself into trouble agreeing to a meeting at 10 o'clock. So I better go there a little bit late. So we will stop there for today and then continue on with the next class. Any questions for me?